We're going to skip lecture 63B for the time being. If nothing else, it'll be in the text will be in your textbook when you get it. And we're going to go on to lecture 63C, Bolshevism Spreads to New Zealand. And we're going to begin by a discussion of the fight for the 8-hour working day in New Zealand. And that began in 1840, when New Zealand workers were among the first in the world to claim the right to the 8-hour day. They were led by the carpenter Samuel Parnell in Wellington. Then several thousand trade union members and supporters attended parades in New Zealand's main centers. Government employees were given the day off to attend the parades, and many businesses closed for at least part of that day. On the 28th of October in 1890, the Maritime Council, an organization of transport and mining unions, was established. And later that year, the fledgling union movement was decimated by defeat in a trans-Tasman maritime strike. However, the first Labor Day held on that day was a huge success. In Wellington, the highlight was an appearance by the elderly Parnell, who died just a few weeks later. That, you'll recall, was the guy who in 1840 led the first parade in New Zealand for the 8-hour working day. Now, following the failure of the Trans-Tasman Maritime Strike of 1890, some major employers refused to recognize unions, blacklisted their members, and slashed wages and conditions. The Liberal government that took office in 1891 was determined to find an alternative to industrial conflict and to foster the union movement, which it saw as a key political ally. Now, pie-card traders in the unions were happy to join them. The brainchild of Minister of Labor William Pember Reeves created the Ica Act, which recognized trade unions and individual employers or industrial unions of employers as the responsible parties in the negotiation of wages, working conditions, and other employment. Each party would be required, if in dispute with the other, to discuss the matter at district boards of conciliation. If this failed to produce an agreement, the dispute would go to a national court of arbitration, and its ruling would be final. The 1894 Industrial Conciliation and Arbitration Act, that is the Ica Act, made New Zealand the first country in the world to outlaw strikes and introduce compulsory arbitration. After 1895, the union movement began to recover. The Liberal Party government that had passed the compulsory industrial conciliation and arbitration system got the credit for working-class militancy, and it was an early example of pie-card trade union leaders selling out the proletariat Menshevik style. Therefore, New Zealand had the misleading reputation as a working man's paradise and a country without strikes. Each Labor Day parade annually on 28th of October has drawn huge crowds in Palmerston North and Napier, as well as in Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and Dunedin. Unionists and supporters march behind colorful banners and ornate floats, and the parades are followed by popular picnics and sporting events. Now, these parades always had a political purpose. Originally, workers in some industries had long enjoyed an 8-hour day, but it was not a legal entitlement. Other workers, including seamen, farm laborers, and hotel, restaurant, and shop employees, still worked much longer hours. Many suffered unpleasant and dangerous working conditions. Unionists wanted the Liberal Party to pass legislation enforcing the 8-hour day for all workers, but the Cap government refused. By 1905, many workers had become disillusioned with compulsory arbitration. The arbitration court refused to adjust wages to match inflation. Ideas of socialism and revolutionary industrial unionism were finding a ready audience accordingly. Flax workers, seamen, watersiders, and miners were particularly receptive. Revolutionary industrial unionism encouraged workers to unite in large unions based around an industry rather than a craft or occupation, with the ultimate goal of establishing socialism. The unions covering the skilled trades tended to view these new ideas with suspicion and stayed in the arbitration system. And I'm sure by now, those of you who've studied the U.S. labor movement at all in the chapters on Volume 1 know this is an old story, this division between craft unions, the so-called aristocracy of labor, and industrial unionism. In 1908, the blackball miners' strike challenged the arbitration system. A new generation of union leaders, including Pat Hickley, Patty Webb, and Bob Semple, openly advocated class war. After blackball, miners' unions combined in the New Zealand Federation of Miners. Many federation unions deregistered from the arbitration system, legally enabling them to engage in direct negotiation with the capitalists and the right to strike. The Red Feds. In 1910, a federation embracing non-mining unions became the New Zealand Federation of Labour, popularly known as the Red Federation or the Red Feds. In the early 20th century, worker mobility was high, and traveling activists spread political messages. North America was a major source of radical ideas. Pat Hickey, a New Zealander who had worked in the USA, brought home the socialist message he had learned from the radical Western Federation of Miners and from the Socialist Party of America. Canadian agitator H.M. Fitzgerald promoted the ideas of the Socialist Party and the industrial workers of the world, while his compatriot J.B. King was another militant advocate for the IWW. A steady stream of unions deregistered from the Arbitration Act, making gains through direct negotiation and a series of strikes. The New Zealand Employers Federation and the Farmers Union were deeply worried. They decided the Arbitration Act was the most effective way of controlling militant unions. In 1912, the Employers Federation developed a new tactic, which was to establish an organizing and defense fund to combat socialism, syndicalism, and anarchy. This, encouraging workers to set up arbitration unions at workplaces with established Red Fed unions, undermined the power of militant unions. Because agreements reached by the arbitration unions were legally applied to members of the Red Fed unions as well. Class war at Waihi. In 1912, the Waihi strike broke out when the powerful Red Fed-affiliated Waihi Trade Union of Workers refused to work with an arbitrational engine drivers union. The strike at the country's largest gold mine resulted in the destruction of the Waihi Trade Union, as strikers' families were expelled from the town and striker Frederick Evans was killed. Heavy police intervention at Waihi was enabled by William Massey's Conservative Reform Party that took power in the typical Cap Tweedledee Tweedledum style in July 1912. Massey used the full force of the state power against militant unionists. In this, his new Commissioner of Police, John Cullen, enthusiastically supported him. And now we come to the great 1913 strikes. Remember, on a worldwide basis, the profits that were coming back from the colonies to the capitalist countries in 1913 were so enormous that they finally decided that the best thing they could do was to go to war, because that way they could liquidate the supernumerary millions of workers they no longer needed in Europe and take the chance that they could grab each other's properties to their own advantage. And so they rolled the dice and they went to war in the following year. At any rate, in New Zealand in 1913, there were a series of strikes between October 1913 and mid-January 1914. It was New Zealand's most violent and disruptive industrial confrontation. 16,000 workers went on strike out of a population of just over 1 million total. Now, this strike wave began with two relatively small disputes. The first at a Huntly coal mine, the second on the Wellington waterfront. It was the right time and place. The Caps had been engineering to use state power to smash the workers' movement. It began with a power struggle of militant unionists against organized industrial Caps, Cap farmers, and the government. The striking unions were affiliated to the United Federation of Labor, the Red Feds. They had withdrawn from the country's arbitration system in favor of direct negotiations with employers, during which they had the right to strike. The strike began with watersiders and miners' unions. They were later joined by seamen, drivers, and builders and laborers. The strikers were opposed by the New Zealand Employers Federation and the Farmers Union. Big capitalist farmers and the rural laborers formed the core of the mounted special constables known as Massey's Cossacks. The specials were sent into the main urban centers to attack workers and open up the wharves. Prime Minister William Massey's Reform Party government gave them full state backing to defeat the unions. The strike affected most port towns and coal mining settlements. Generally, the moderate unions, though still participating in the arbitration system, refused to join the strike. In Auckland, however, there was a general strike from 8 to 22 November involving arbitrationists as well as red-fed unions. The 1913 Unity Conferences followed the Waihee strikes. The radical industrial IWW, staunch believers in direct industrial action, attacked the Federation of Labor for failing to give enough support to the strikers. For their part, the arbitrationist unions, who had refused to support the strike, were shocked at the level of force employed by the government, and moderate and militant unions attended 2 Unity Conferences, both held in Wellington in January and July of 1913. At the July conference, a new enlarged United Federation of Labor was formed, including militant and some of the Picard unions. This development deeply worried the Employers' Federation and the farmers' unions, who were determined to destroy the United Federation. New Zealand's irreconcilable contradictions. Imperialism launches its world war. Now, capitalism as a global socio-cultural stage had developed irreconcilable internal and external contradictions. V.I. Lenin would explicate them well in his treatise on imperialism, the highest developed stage of capitalism. This he would soon be working out in a Bern, Switzerland library, as the Social Democrats sold out the workers worldwide and joined the Caps in getting their way out of the crisis. And their way out was war. They would kill as many now supernumerary workers in their home countries as possible, and their greed might well be satisfied with getting a larger share of the enormous 1913 profits coming back from the exploitation of colonial labor in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And they all saw that as worth a try, and they threw the dice. Upon the outbreak of the war, the New Zealand government authorized the raising of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, NZEF, for service overseas. Mobilization for the NZEF had already begun, with preparations discreetly beginning a few days prior to the declaration of war. The Caps in New Zealand knew the war was coming, as for that matter did the unions in the Second International, all complicit in the forthcoming atrocity. The military history of New Zealand during World War I began in August 1914. Then Great Britain declared war on Germany. The New Zealand government followed without hesitation, despite its geographic isolation and small population. A declaration of war by the United Kingdom automatically included New Zealand. 100,444 New Zealand troops and nurses served overseas from 1914 to 1918 out of a population of just over 1 million. 42% of men of military age served in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, fighting in the Gallipoli campaign, and on the Western Front, 16,697 New Zealanders were killed and 41,317 were wounded during the war. A 58% casualty rate of troublemakers was exactly what the New Zealand Caps wanted as their way out of their own labor crisis. A further 1,000 men died within 5 years of the war's end from injuries sustained, and another 507 had died in training. The First World War saw Maori soldiers serve for the first time in a major conflict with the New Zealand Army. They had been prepared for a modern combat when some fought in the Second Boer War in South Africa. A Maori contingent took part in the Gallipoli campaign and later served with distinction on the Western Front as part of the New Zealand Maori Pioneer Battalion. 2,688 Maori and 346 Pacific Islanders, including 150 Niueans, served with New Zealand's forces in total. In March 1921, in Wellington, New Zealand, Bolshevik-oriented Social Democrats answered Vladimir Lenin's 1919 call at the formation of the Third or Communist International in Moscow. They declared the establishment of the Communist Party of New Zealand with E.J. Dyer as its first secretary. On the 9th of April, 1921, there was an organizational conference held at Wellington Socialist Hall which was the headquarters of the Wellington Socialist Party, that kicked off the Communist Party of New Zealand, CPNZ, with structure and program. The majority of the movement's participants during the decade of the 1920s were either native New Zealanders by birth or first-generation immigrants from Great Britain, Scotland, Ireland, or Wales. In 1923, the CPNZ participated in elections for the first time, with its inaugural candidate drawing an impressive 2,128 votes in a race for election to the Dunedin City Council. In 1924, the journal Communist was published in Auckland when the CPNZ found pie-card control of the newspaper of the New Zealand Federation of Labour, the Maoriland Worker, was total. Geography and difficult transportation meant the organization had many branches, but they operated in virtual isolation. Anyway, a conference was held during the 1924 Christmas break, attended by delegates of the Communist Party of Australia. The CPNZ decided the better part of valor was temporarily to make the CPNZ a section of the Communist Party of Australia. In 1925, there was therefore a 6-month organizing tour by the Australian communist Norman Jeffrey. Then in April 1926, a new monthly magazine was launched for the New Zealand Communist Party called the Workers' Vanguard. It was published in the isolated inland mining town of Blackball, located on the rainy western side of the South Island. In December 1926, the NZCP became independent again, and its headquarters was moved from Wellington to Blackball, and it would remain there until returned to the North Island and the capital city in 1928. The NZCP was Leninist, and that meant its members were a select group of professional revolutionaries. They had a major influence within the national miners' and seamen's unions. Of course, the Cap state apparatus paid close attention from the start, with the New Zealand Police and New Zealand Army both engaged in their systematic monitoring. In January 1928, the Executive Committee of the Communist International, ECCI, sent the CPNZ a cable from Moscow requesting that the party dispatch a delegate to the forthcoming 6th World Congress of the Comintern. The Comintern's 6th Congress would be held in July and August of 1928, and accordingly the CPNZ sent 28-year-old Wellington communist Dick Griffin from the Seamen's Union. Griffin would be the party's first ever delegate to a Comintern gathering in Moscow. Griffin had to travel cautiously to the Soviet Union. Being a seaman, he knew how to arrange his trip, with his ocean voyage going first to Australia before heading to Great Britain via the Suez Canal. British authorities, of course, were aware of his presence by the time he arrived, and they detained him for questioning and seized many of his documents, but Griffin was allowed to depart in time to reach Moscow before the 17 July 1928 opening of the World Comintern Congress. I just want to bring to your attention for the moment the date. This is the end of July of 1928, and 12 months later the world capitalist system is going to collapse. Now keep that in mind. The 6th Congress of the Comintern Analysis of the Global Crisis of Capitalism was extraordinarily incisive in my opinion, and when it came to New Zealand, spot on. The entire document is available on the internet at the Marxist Internet Archive. And I'm not going to read it here, but I then go through the outline of the 6th Comintern Congress, the introduction, the second part, the general crisis of capitalism, the first phase of the world revolution, thirdly, the ultimate aim of the Communist International, world communism, for the period of transition from capitalism to socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat, and of course there's a bunch of subheadings under all of this. As I say, I'm not going to go through all of that. The important thing is that in August 1928, for this discussion, the 9th full session of the Executive Committee proclaimed that the capitalist system was entering the period of final collapse. Therefore, all communist parties would adopt an aggressive militant line, and the Comintern labeled all right-wing social democrat parties as social fascist, but allowed for exceptions. In October 29, 1929, 12 months later, the world capitalist system did collapse, exactly as predicted at the 6th Congress. Anyway, The Comintern's resolution on the tasks of the Communist Party of New Zealand was brought back to Wellington by Dick Griffin, and it shows that New Zealand was considered by the Executive Committee to be one of those exceptions, because it maintained these instructions that New Zealand was still undergoing a steady upward swing in its capitalist development. This created relatively good conditions for workers, thus serving to prevent an immediate revolutionary situation in New Zealand, and thus the CPNZ was directed to focus its attention on education and to continue agitation and propaganda in defense of the USSR and the promotion of progressive actions. Then, in May 1929, Dick Griffin had become the CPNZ's first full-time organizer. In August of that same year, he assumed the role of General Secretary of the party. In July 1929, the CPNZ was subjected to unrelenting federal police persecution, including a raid which seized the internal records and literature of the Wellington branch, and there was a subsequent successful prosecution of 5 members of the governing Central Executive Committee for possession and sale of allegedly seditious literature. Party leaders were particularly targeted, with 3 more members of the Central Executive Committee arrested in 1930. For New Zealand, as for most of the world outside the USSR, the Great Depression began 14 months after the Comintern said the collapse of the world capitalist system was imminent. Now, the 1929 collapse, more closely viewed. On 29 October 1929, the collapse began and was the most shattering economic experience ever recorded in New Zealand. Exports fell by 45% in 2 years. National income fell by 40% in 3 years. The balance of payments was further weakened by the burden of interest on the overseas debt. At the worst point of the Depression, the number of unemployed exceeded 70,000. New Zealand's caps had their main profit centers in the export industries. That was where the biggest effects of the cap collapse were felt. From 1929 to 1932, the sharpest price fall was in wool, which declined by 60%. Dairy farmers tried to make ends meet by increasing production, and in doing so forced the export prices of butter and cheese still lower. The dairy price index continued to fall until 1934. Butter exported rose from 1.6 EWT in 1929, CWT in 1929 to 2.6 million in 1933. Cheese exports also rose, though much less rapidly, and meat even less, as it was largely consumed at home, but it was the most traumatic experience since the founding of the colony. Recently arrived New Zealanders found themselves disillusioned by the appearance in their adopted country of conditions they thought they had escaped. They were learning the hard way the correct analysis of the 6th Comintern Congress, that capitalism was a world system and it was doomed because it doomed them. Most could not afford to leave, and even if they could, where would they go? Only the USSR was depression-free, and cap propaganda had poisoned many minds with regard to Bolshevik Russia. As bad as were the conditions in New Zealand, they were less demoralizing than those in the United Kingdom, where the percentage of the labor force unemployed was a good deal higher than in Australia and New Zealand. In March 1930, the CPNZ received a communication from the Comintern Executive Committee directing it to take a hard line on social fascism. The CPNZ was instructed to attempt to assume leadership of the New Zealand workers' movement by working to expose and destroy all the laborite, pacifist, social democratic illusions. Now it's important again to take a look at these dates, because when Dirk first came back from the meeting at the 6th Congress, he had all of these special exceptional instructions that the Executive Committee had set for New Zealand. Then, 14 months later, the world capitalist system did collapse, and now, 5 months after that collapse, the Executive Committee has decided that New Zealand also needs to take a harder line on the social fascists, that is, the Menshevik type, the Bernie Sanders kind of right-wing socialist. The CPNZ was instructed to attempt to assume leadership of the New Zealand workers' movement by working to expose and destroy all the laborite, pacifist, social democratic illusions. Workers needed to understand now, not later, that there was no possibility of solving social problems under the existing political and economic regime. The worldwide cap collapse accelerated the need for political as well as class consciousness of all working people. So by October 1932, cap cop attacks and incarcerations had left only one member of the Communist Party of New Zealand's Central Executive Committee who had been a member of the party for longer than a year that wasn't in jail. Some members of the Central Executive Committee had only been there for 2 months. The party was impoverished by legal costs and its coffers drained by publishing the Red Worker. Despite everything, this publication had to be brought out as it was the only rival publication to the Picard trade unionist Maoriland Worker. The Comintern made emergency cash transfers to the CPNZ to keep it going. The cap cops carefully scrutinized party publications, however, and 2 issues of the Red Worker and a CPNZ pamphlet were adjudged seditious in 1932, and those responsible for their publication, at least the ones the cops could find, were jailed for more than a year. The CPNZ lost influence in the country's Picard trade union movement during the late 20s and early 30s because it insisted on supporting solidarity strikes with workers in other countries. A 1929 call for a minor strike in sympathy with mine and timber workers in Australia lost the party influence among the Picard-controlled Miners' Union and the South Island's West Coast. In 1931, the CPNZ effort to blackball a Japanese ship alienated the Picard bosses in the Seamen's Union. By the middle of 1933, the Communist Party of New Zealand was in crisis, with its entire Central Committee jailed for publication of the pamphlet Karl Marx and the Struggle of the Masses. The New Zealand-born Fred Freeman returned to the country to assume the position of General Secretary of the CPNZ after 4 years serving in Moscow. Now, politically astute and organizationally adroit Freeman promoted university graduates Clement Gordon Watson and his future wife, Elsie Farrelly, to positions of party leadership. Their party veteran Ernie Brooks joined them. Now, this group of 4 managed to stay out of jail and lead the CPNZ through the end of 1935. Under the group of 4, the operations of the CPNZ were made efficient, official directives and circulars were issued systematically by the Central Committee to local party committees, and representatives of the Central Committee also began to travel regularly to visit their local organizations. Dues collecting and record keeping of branches was regular, and increased attention was paid to the problem of internal security. In 1933, Comintern policy began to change following the disastrous victory of the Nazi Party in Germany. Joseph Stalin and George Dimitrov advocated the Popular Front against fascism by 1935. Now, under Freeman and the group of 4, the CPNZ leadership took the first Popular Front steps late in 1933. Then the CPNZ approached the National Executive Committee of the New Zealand Labour Party with a proposal for a joint campaign against fascism. Now, no answer was given by these right-wing Social Democrats. Parallel appeals were made to several Picard trade unions, including the miners, seamen, and dock workers, with only the militant miners providing a response. The CPNZ accelerated its efforts to drive a wedge between the rank and file and the leadership of the rightist Social Democrats and their Picard union allies. The CPNZ called this policy the United Front from Below. The distrust and alienation between the Communist Party and the Labour Party leadership carried over through the November 1935 general election, during which CPNZ made use of the slogan, "Neither reaction nor labor," in the campaign. Now, Popular Front in World War II. By 1935, the CPNZ had grown as more and more workers and intellectuals realized that the Leninist way was the only way for everyday people to build a brave new world. The party's delegate to the 7th World Congress of the Comintern in Moscow was Leo Sim. Now, he reported there that the CPNZ party membership had increased by 600% from 1928 to 1935, or now had 400 dues-paying members. In 1935, Freeman landed on the wrong side of the Popular Front-driven Comintern decision that the CPNZ should seek formal affiliation with the Labor Party sooner rather than later. Freeman came to be politically isolated, and the Auckland district of the party, backed by Lance Sharkey of the Communist Party of Australia, led the charge for his removal as an alleged impediment to the new international line. In December 1936, Freeman was removed from the party leadership and suspended from the party soon thereafter for failing to accept this decision, and in 1937 Freeman was expelled altogether. In 1938, CPNZ headquarters were moved from the capital city of Wellington to the booming northern port city of Auckland. In July 1939, a new weekly was launched called The People's Voice. This headquarters city and official organ would remain constant for the rest of the party's life. However, by September 1939, the CPZN was in direct conflict, CPNZ was in direct conflict with the government after the Brit declaration of war against Germany, and the CPNZ agitated in People's Voice anti-war propaganda. Then, in June 1941, when the Nazis broke the German-Soviet non-aggression agreement and invaded the USSR, the CPNZ became a vocal supporter of New Zealand's war effort. The country was the military ally of the Soviet Union, and accordingly the way was cleared for recruitment and above-ground legal operations. By 1945, party membership reached a previously unknown all-time high of about 2,000, and the circulation of People's Voice topped 14,000 copies per week. This level of membership and support would continue through 1946. And that brings us to a conclusion of our discussion of the formation and evolution of the Communist Party of New Zealand. And I'm going to go next to Micronesia. And I'm just going to mention this particular book for that if you get a chance, you might like to take a look at it. If you get it in your library, it's called On the Road of the Winds. Now, in my lectures that are going to accompany these coming lectures on Oceania, including Micronesia, they are going to be up to date as of this year, 2017. This particular book was published in the year 2000, but it was recommended to me by a colleague who's an expert on Oceania, and I have found it has a tremendous amount of data in there. Not that it doesn't need to be supplemented by the more recent archaeological excavations. But in Micronesia, everything that's been done archaeologically has been done since 1978. And this includes Guam and all of the island chains that became important in the marine island hopping of the Second World War. Anyway, with those comments, we'll conclude this, and in the next lecture, we'll move on to primitive communism in Micronesia.